Have you ever witnessed a man in an Armani suit dig his own grave with a gold-plated shovel? Julian Vance thought he buried the evidence, and more importantly, he believed he buried me. But that corporate parasite forgot the most basic survival rule in America: never hand that shovel to the woman who designed the cemetery. Sit down and listen closely, because what happened in that courtroom was a nuclear blast that incinerated an empire. Welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. Everyone, I want to sincerely thank you for always being here with us, but unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our monetization features, leaving us with absolutely zero budget to keep this operation running. If you find today's story compelling, please consider supporting us by joining the Patreon channel of Boss Revenge Stories to listen to exclusive, incredibly detailed true stories that are even better. On Patreon, we provide much longer episodes describing complex situations that we simply cannot make public on YouTube, featuring multiple emotional voice actors bringing a single story to life. You can support us right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link down in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us begin today's story. And my name is Alice Kim. I am 34 years old. I am a white woman of European descent, though I kept the surname Kim from a brief, entirely pragmatic marriage that ended years ago. The name is sharp and concise, which perfectly matches my personality and my role as the Director of Quality Assurance at ERUPTED Biologistics. We were not running a standard logistics company moving consumer electronics or fast fashion across the country. ERUPTED was a futuristic titan in the medical and scientific supply chain, specializing in the transportation of top-secret, highly volatile biological samples worth billions of dollars. We moved experimental vaccines, synthetic enzymes, and classified pathogens. My job was the final line of defense. I ensured that nothing leaked, nothing spoiled, and nothing caused an international biohazard incident. I am a woman of strict principles. I operate entirely on cold, hard data. If a thermal seal showed even a fraction of a degree of temperature variance, I grounded the entire transport fleet. I had absolutely zero tolerance for technical flaws, no matter how microscopic or insignificant they appeared to the untrained eyes of upper management. The delicate balance of my department was shattered by the arrival of Julian Vance, our newly appointed Vice President of Operations. Julian was the quintessential modern executive parasite, a man who possessed no hard skills but had mastered the art of failing upward. He wore impeccably tailored suits, sported perfectly whitened teeth, and spoke entirely in empty corporate buzzwords. Every sentence out of his mouth was laced with terms like disruptive innovation, synergistic optimization, and agile paradigms. To Julian, my rigorous safety protocols were not lifelines protecting the company from catastrophic lawsuits. They were merely annoying speed bumps on the highway to his massive quarterly bonuses. He looked at my meticulously crafted quality assurance checks and saw only wasted time and lost revenue. He believed that moving fast and breaking things was a valid business strategy, even when the things being broken could potentially start a localized epidemic. The inevitable collision between my reality and his delusion happened inside the main glass boardroom. Julian had summoned the entire executive board to announce his brilliant new strategy. He wanted to launch our next-generation biological cooling container, known as the Nexus 5, 3 months ahead of schedule. The reason was entirely driven by greed. The Department of Defense was dangling a massive, multi-billion-dollar logistics contract, and Julian wanted to lock it down before the fiscal quarter ended to secure his own promotion. He stood at the head of the mahogany table, projecting flashy, colorful charts that showed exponential profit growth, completely ignoring the grim engineering realities hiding beneath his presentation. When he confidently slid the final safety approval document across the table toward me, expecting a compliant and immediate signature, I did not even pick up the pen. The room grew dead silent. I looked him straight in the eye and flatly refused to sign the authorization. Instead, I opened my own file and projected the unedited, raw engineering data onto the main screen. I calmly explained to the board that the Nexus V system had a critical design flaw that had not been resolved. During our advanced stress tests, The cooling unit demonstrated a 4% power failure rate whenever it passed through atmospheric low-pressure zones. A 4% failure rate might be an acceptable risk if we were shipping frozen vegetables, but we were dealing with synthetic materials and volatile organisms. If the container lost power at 30,000 feet, the cargo would be irreparably compromised within minutes. Julian let out a loud, theatrical sigh, rolling his eyes as he paced around the room to ensure every board member was watching his performance. He leaned heavily over the table, staring down at me, and chose to publicly mock my professional assessment. "Alice is just being our typical risk-paranoid gatekeeper," he announced smoothly, flashing a deeply condescending smile to the executives. "In the real business world, we have to embrace acceptable margins of error if we want to be industry pioneers. We cannot let an endless obsession with perfection hold back the future of this entire corporation." He made it perfectly clear to everyone in that room that my position was an obsolete obstacle, and that I was the only thing standing between Ethirus Biologistics and unimaginable wealth. The pressure inside the Ethirus Biologistics building thickened as the Department of Defense contract deadline closed in on us. With only 48 hours left before the final presentation, the air in the executive suites felt intensely heavy, suffocating beneath the constant, low hum of the central air conditioning. I was walking down the plushly carpeted corridor of the 12th floor when Julian Vance intercepted me. He did not use his usual booming theatrical voice that he reserved for the board members. Instead, he gripped my elbow with a sharp, bruising intensity and steered me away from the main hallway, pushing me straight into his private office. He locked the heavy oak door behind us with a loud click. I immediately noticed that the standard corporate recording device on his conference phone had been physically unplugged from the wall socket. There were no witnesses, no digital trails, and no human resources representatives present to mediate. It was just the two of us trapped inside a soundproof room. Julian leaned against his polished mahogany desk, completely dropping the charismatic persona he wore in public. His eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely dead. "Listen to me very carefully, Alice," he said, his voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss that echoed slightly in the quiet room. "I am completely done playing these little academic games with you. You are going to log into the quality assurance database right now, and you are going to manually adjust the atmospheric stress parameters on the Nexus V report. I want that 4% failure rate erased from existence. Smooth out the data curve. Make the container look safe on paper so we can get this multi-billion-dollar contract signed by Friday afternoon." I stood perfectly still, keeping my expression completely neutral, though my mind was rapidly calculating the exact legal ramifications of his brazen demand. "What you are asking me to do is not just a simple breach of internal company policy, Julian," I replied, forcing my tone to remain perfectly level and devoid of fear. "You are directly ordering me to commit a federal felony. Falsifying biological transport safety data falls under strict federal jurisdiction. If those containers fail at high altitudes and a synthetic pathogen leaks into the environment, it is not a simple product recall. It becomes a severe national security crisis, and I will absolutely not go to federal prison so you can secure your massive quarterly bonus." Julian pushed himself violently off the desk, invading my personal space. The smell of his expensive cologne was nauseatingly strong, mixing with the sharp scent of his own nervous sweat. "You think you are so untouchable behind your little spreadsheets," he sneered, jabbing a manicured finger directly toward my face. "Let me make this crystal clear for you. I am the Vice President of Operations. If you do not comply with my direct order, I will personally ensure you never work in the biotechnology sector again for the rest of your life. I will bury your reputation so deep in industry blacklists that you will be incredibly lucky to find a job managing a fast food supply chain." When I did not flinch or break eye contact, his face flushed with pure, unrestrained rage. He stormed over to his master terminal and slammed his hand onto the biometric scanner. "Fine, if you want to play the stubborn corporate martyr, I will just remove you from the equation entirely." Right in front of me, He utilized his executive override credentials to activate a catastrophic corporate loophole known as the emergency protocol. It was a dangerous relic from the early startup days of the company, originally designed for absolute crisis management, but Julian willfully weaponized it. By officially declaring an operational emergency, he legally bypassed my entire department, neutralizing my final approval authority with a single, aggressive keystroke. The execution of his tyrannical plan was ruthlessly efficient. Later that exact same night, while I was sleeping in my own bed, the Corporate Information Technology Department, acting under Julian's direct and strict orders, executed a complete purge of my system access. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, my remote server connections were abruptly severed. My security clearance was permanently downgraded from Level 5 down to a meaningless Level 1. When I walked into the headquarters building the following morning, my digital keycard flashed a harsh red light at the elevator bank leading to the secure underground laboratories. I was forcibly relocated to a tiny, windowless office on the 3rd floor and assigned to a completely garbage project analyzing the recycling efficiency of standard cardboard packaging materials. It was a humiliating, powerless position deliberately meant to break my spirit and force me to quit, but the true horror of his actions unfolded later that afternoon. I managed to view the internal shipping manifest through a low-level, unsecured terminal. The mass transport order for the first massive fleet of Nexus V containers had been officially issued to the logistics teams. At the bottom of the digital authorization form, right where my personal electronic signature was legally required, there was a crude, forced override stamp that had been entirely fabricated by Julian's office to fraudulently simulate my department's consent. The final blow arrived just as the clock struck 5 in the afternoon. A representative from the Human Resources Department, a known crony who practically operated as Julian's personal enforcer, walked into my miserable new office. He did not say a single word to me. He simply handed me a thick manila envelope, offered a deeply patronizing smirk, and turned on his heel to walk away. Inside was a formal letter of immediate suspension. The text was dressed up in polite corporate jargon, but the underlying message was violently clear. It stated that I was being placed on indefinite unpaid leave pending a comprehensive review of my professional competence and behavioral insubordination. They demanded my physical company badge and ordered me to vacate the premises within 30 minutes under the strict supervision of armed building security. Julian Vance had stolen my authority, forged my approval, and then locked me out of the building to ensure I could not interfere with his fraudulent empire. He truly believed he had completely disarmed me. He had absolutely no idea what was waiting for him in the dark. The armed security guards and the human resources enforcers stood in my doorway, clearly anticipating a dramatic breakdown. They expected me to scream, to throw objects, or perhaps to launch into a desperate, tearful plea for my career. They wanted a chaotic reaction to validate their aggressive tactics. I gave them absolutely nothing. I did not flinch. I did not argue. I looked down at the humiliating suspension letter, folded it precisely in half, and slipped it into the pocket of my blazer. A faint, almost imperceptible smile crossed my lips. The human resources representative actually took a step backward, his artificial confidence faltering. The utter silence in the room unsettled him far more than any screaming match ever could. I methodically began packing my personal belongings into a single, generic cardboard box. My movements were deliberately slow, measured, and entirely unbothered. I placed my favorite pen, a framed photograph of a snowy landscape, and a small potted succulent into the box. I walked past the enforcers, allowing them to escort me out of the glass building and into the glaring afternoon sun. Projecting an image of total defeat, it was a flawless, terrifying performance. What Julian Vance and his arrogant sycophants failed to realize was that I had never truly trusted the corporate infrastructure of Ethirus Biologistics 3 years ago, during the very first prototyping phase of our advanced biological cooling systems. I anticipated a scenario exactly like this one. The executive board was always too hungry for profit, and I knew they would eventually try to cut corners on safety. So, I engineered a microscopic, highly advanced independent diagnostic relay. I privately called it the Shadow Protocol. This ghost chip was integrated seamlessly into the deepest physical layers of the motherboard on every single unit rolling off our assembly lines. It operated entirely outside the official company network. It bypassed their internal firewalls. It bypassed their expensive security audits. It was my own personal, undetectable research mechanism, silently gathering raw, unfiltered telemetry straight from the hardware itself. That night, the atmosphere in my home basement was perfectly still and chillingly quiet. The only illumination came from the stark, icy blue glow of my private server rack. I sat in the dark, sipping black coffee, feeling the adrenaline sharpen my focus. My fingers danced across the mechanical keyboard with practiced precision. I executed a deeply hidden, dormant command script. A secure, encrypted bridge opened across the internet. Instantly, thousands of ghost chips woke up from their digital slumber. Every single cooling unit currently sitting in the corporate warehouses began broadcasting its true, unmanipulated status directly to my personal terminal. I swiftly routed this massive stream of raw data into a completely anonymous, decentralized cloud network. I bypassed the corporate servers entirely. The unedited atmospheric stress failures, the lethal power drops, the critical temperature fluctuations. All of it synchronized flawlessly onto a secure digital ledger that no corrupt executive could ever erase, alter, or deny. With the undeniable hardware data safely locked away in the cloud, I turned my attention to the internal corporate network. Before the Information Technology Department revoked my administrative privileges, I had established a series of encrypted backdoors buried deep within the company intranet. Now, under the cover of darkness, I used them. I systematically pulled the hidden server logs directly from Julian Vance's personal terminal. I extracted the exact, undeniable timestamp of his biometric login. I downloaded the specific keystroke registry, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that he manually altered the risk assessment spreadsheets. I secured a pristine, uncorrupted copy of the forced digital override he used to bypass my final safety check. Every malicious, illegal action he took in the shadows was perfectly illuminated, downloaded, and encrypted onto 3 separate, physically disconnected hard drives. I was building an airtight digital guillotine, and Julian had practically handed me the blueprints. The following morning, I made my final, devastating move on the corporate chessboard. I drafted a formal, legally binding letter of resignation. I did not mention my unfair suspension, his petty insults, or his blatant threats. Emotion had no place in this document. Instead, I meticulously detailed the exact structural flaws of the new cooling units. I outlined the specific atmospheric conditions that would trigger a total system collapse. I clearly stated my professional, data-driven recommendation that the launch be halted immediately to prevent a catastrophic biological hazard. I printed the document on heavy, premium stock paper. I drove to the main post office and sent the letter via certified mail directly to the private residence of the chairman of the board of directors. I obtained a stamped, time-dated receipt of delivery. It was a cold, impenetrable legal shield. By sending that certified warning, I completely fulfilled my fiduciary duty to the corporation. I legally washed my hands of their impending self-inflicted doom. Then, I simply vanished from the corporate world. I permanently changed my phone number. I completely deleted all my professional networking profiles. I cleanly severed every single tie with the biotechnology sector. I took my accumulated savings and leased a modest, beautifully sunlit commercial space in a quiet, unassuming suburban neighborhood. I opened a small retail shop specializing in rare orchids and custom floral arrangements. I traded high-pressure boardroom negotiations for the simple, quiet rhythm of pruning green stems and watering rich soil. My former colleagues whispered that I had suffered a total psychological collapse. They assumed I ran away to hide in disgrace. They could not have been more wrong. I was not hiding. I was waiting. I quietly tended to my flowers, listening to the classical music playing softly in my shop, patiently watching the calendar pages turn. The trap had been flawlessly set. The timer was relentlessly ticking down. It was only a matter of time before the entire empire went up in flames. 8 months passed in a blur of quiet mornings and blooming orchids. But in the ruthless world of corporate biotechnology, gravity always collects its debts. The disaster I had predicted with cold mathematical certainty finally materialized 30,000 feet above the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains. A massive cargo plane was transporting a highly sensitive payload of experimental synthetic enzymes. The shipment belonged to a premier international pharmaceutical partner, and its insured value was a staggering $1.2 billion. As the aircraft navigated through a severe high-altitude, low-pressure zone, the atmospheric stress reached the exact critical threshold I had warned them about. Deep inside the cargo hold, the Nexus V biological cooling containers systematically failed. The master power grids short-circuited. The backup thermal regulators died completely. Within 45 minutes, the interior temperature of the unit spiked, and the entire payload of synthetic enzymes was irreversibly cooked. While there were thankfully no human casualties, the corporate devastation was absolute and immediate. The financial damage was a fatal blow, but the reputational destruction was apocalyptic. The moment the news leaked to the financial press the following Tuesday morning, Ethirus Biologistics stock entered a violent, uncontrollable freefall, losing almost 40% of its total market value before the opening bell even finished ringing. The pharmaceutical partner did not hesitate. By Wednesday afternoon, they filed a massive corporate lawsuit against Ethirus, officially charging the company with gross negligence, breach of contract, and intentional fraud for actively concealing known technical flaws. The crisis escalated beyond civil litigation when unmarked black vehicles began parking outside the corporate headquarters. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had officially opened an inquiry into the fraudulent transportation of hazardous biological materials. Inside the executive glass boardroom of Ethirus, the atmosphere was absolute pandemonium. The polished veneer of invincibility was completely shattered. Julian Vance was practically hyperventilating. His expensive Armani suit was wrinkled. His perfect hair was disheveled, and dark circles dragged down his eyes. The room smelled of stale coffee, nervous sweat, and blind panic. Executives were screaming over each other, desperately trying to shield their own departments from the impending federal indictments. Julian paced erratically around the mahogany table, his mind frantically searching for an escape route. Like any cornered parasite, he resorted to the most cowardly survival tactic available. He decided to shift the entire burden of guilt. "We need a narrative, and we need it right now," Julian yelled over the chaotic shouting, slamming his fist onto the table to command the room. This was not an executive failure. This was a catastrophic failure of the Quality Assurance Department. Alice Kim is the one responsible for this mess. He looked around the room, his eyes wild and desperate, weaving a pathetic but dangerous lie. She was a disgruntled, unstable employee. She completely missed the atmospheric stress flaw during her initial inspections. When she realized her massive mistake, she tried to cover it up, and then she quit in a dramatic rage to avoid the consequences. "We are the victims of a vindictive former director." He immediately ordered his loyal lackeys in the information technology department to start generating fake internal memos. He demanded they fabricate a completely false digital paper trail, suggesting I had negligently approved the faulty power grids just days before my departure. The corporate legal team, a pack of ruthless, high-priced defense attorneys, immediately seized upon Julian's fabricated narrative. They needed a perfect scapegoat to offer to the federal investigators and the furious shareholders. They drafted an incredibly aggressive, legally terrifying subpoena designed to forcefully drag me out of hiding. The document was an absolute masterpiece of legal intimidation, accusing me of professional negligence, corporate sabotage, and gross incompetence. They intended to legally compel me to testify, planning to publicly butcher my reputation and lay the entire $1.2 billion catastrophe squarely on my shoulders. Miles away from the screaming executives and the impending federal raids, the air in my shop was warm, smelling of damp earth and blooming jasmine. It was a perfectly peaceful Thursday afternoon. I was standing behind the wooden counter, wearing a simple canvas apron, carefully watering a rare, delicate white orchid. The soft chime of the front doorbell broke the quiet ambient music playing in the background. A man in a cheap gray suit walked in, looking completely out of place among the vibrant flora. He scanned the room, his eyes locking onto me. He walked briskly to the counter and slapped a thick, sealed legal envelope right next to my watering can. He declared that I had been officially served and immediately rushed out the door. I set my watering can down. The water droplets glistened on the orchid petals. I picked up the heavy envelope and sliced it open with a pair of gardening shears. I slowly read through the aggressive legal jargon, the fabricated accusations, and the mandatory summons demanding my immediate appearance for a formal legal deposition. The corporate giants thought they were dragging a terrified, helpless victim back into the slaughterhouse. I looked down at the heavy legal paper, and a wide, radiant smile slowly stretched across my face. My pulse remained perfectly steady. I tapped my fingers lightly against the wooden counter and thought to myself quite clearly, the fish has finally taken the bait. The conference room on the 42nd floor of the downtown legal firm was designed to intimidate. It was a cavernous space dominated by a massive, polished stone table and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying view of the city below. I walked through the heavy glass doors precisely on time, carrying nothing but a slim, unbranded leather portfolio. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, my posture perfectly straight, my expression entirely unreadable. Waiting for me on the opposite side of the table was the Aetherist defense team. Julian sat in the center, flanked by three highly aggressive corporate litigators in bespoke navy suits. The lead defense attorney, a notorious legal shark known for mercilessly breaking witnesses, immediately noticed my solitary arrival. He exchanged a brief, highly patronizing glance with Julian. A subtle smirk danced across Julian's face. They saw a woman without legal representation. They automatically assumed my little suburban flower shop had drained my savings, leaving me entirely defenseless against their million-dollar legal machinery. They truly believed I was a foolish lamb wandering willingly into an industrial slaughterhouse. The deposition commenced with the rhythmic, mechanical clicking of the court reporter typing on her stenography machine. The lead attorney launched his offensive immediately, adopting a harsh, overbearing tone meant to rattle my nerves. He reached into his thick briefcase and aggressively slid a stack of freshly printed internal memos across the cold stone table. He tapped his expensive fountain pen against the bottom of the third page. Did you, or did you not, affix your electronic signature to this final quality assurance document on the 12th of October, thereby personally authorizing the deployment of the faulty cooling grids? He demanded, leaning forward to invade my visual space. I looked down at the fabricated document. My pulse remained a steady, tranquil 60 beats per minute. I did not raise my voice, nor did I display a single ounce of defensive panic. I answered him with the cold, absolute precision of a programmed machine. That printed visual representation closely resembles the geometric shape of my digital authorization stamp, I replied evenly. However, a printed visual representation on a piece of standard copy paper does not authenticate the digital origin of the command, nor does it verify the biometric identity of the user who initiated the network override. The defense attorney scoffed loudly, attempting to dismiss my answer as desperate semantics. He continued to aggressively rapid-fire his questions, pulling out more forged emails and manipulated system logs, desperately trying to corner me into a recorded confession of professional negligence. He wanted me to break down, to cry, to angrily deny the accusations so he could use my emotional instability against me in a public courtroom. I gave him absolutely nothing. I was a brick wall absorbing his useless artillery. But there was another player in the room, and he was the entire reason I had allowed myself to be subpoenaed. Sitting quietly at the far end of the long table, taking meticulous notes on a yellow legal pad, was the lead attorney representing the pharmaceutical plaintiffs. He was the man whose client had lost over $1 billion in ruined synthetic enzymes. He was legally permitted to be present to observe the defense interrogate a hostile witness. Every time the defense attorney asked me a question about the server failures, I carefully wove a secondary narrative directly into my answers. I was speaking in plain English, but I was broadcasting an encrypted treasure map directly to the plaintiff. Our standard review protocols were highly compartmentalized, I stated clearly, letting my eyes briefly meet the gaze of the plaintiff's attorney. If an external investigator truly wished to comprehend the unedited failure rates of the hardware, they would waste their time auditing the primary corporate databases. A thorough investigation would bypass the centralized network entirely and look for an independent diagnostic relay. They would search for an immutable cloud ledger that records hardware telemetry directly from the physical source. The plaintiff's attorney instantly stopped writing. The tip of his pen hovered over the yellow paper. He slowly looked up at me, his eyes narrowing sharply as his brilliant legal mind caught the invisible breadcrumbs I was dropping. He understood immediately that I was handing him the exact key to unlock the entire corporate conspiracy. Julian, completely oblivious to the silent transaction occurring across the table, grew arrogant. He leaned back in his plush leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest, visibly enjoying the spectacle of his highly paid lawyers attempting to tear my professional legacy to shreds. He thought he had already won the war. He thought his digital tracks were completely incinerated. The lead defense attorney pressed his hands flat against the table. So, you are sitting here today, completely unrepresented, stubbornly refusing to admit that your department was entirely responsible for the catastrophic system oversight. I slowly turned my head and looked directly into Julian's eyes. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. I am absolutely aware of every single administrative action taken during that production cycle, I said softly, my voice slicing through the heavy air of the conference room. For example, I am intimately aware of the exact administrative node utilized to manually purge the warning alerts from the central server, an action that originated entirely outside of my department. Julian's smug smile began to falter. He uncrossed his arms, suddenly sitting rigidly upright. I leaned slightly forward, never breaking eye contact with him. If I were attempting to locate the individual who actively deleted those vital safety warnings and forced the system override, I would not look at the quality assurance department. I would trace the precise origin protocol directly back to the physical terminal registered at the internal network address of 172.16.254.1. Absolute silence slammed into the room. The only sound was the rapid clicking of the plaintiff's attorney frantically writing down the string of numbers. All the blood violently drained from Julian's face, leaving him a sickening shade of pale gray. He completely froze, looking as though he had just been physically struck. That was the exact, highly classified internal protocol address of his private executive machine in his locked office. It was the precise digital location he had ordered his technicians to wipe clean and physically destroy months ago. A thick bead of cold sweat formed at his temple and slowly tracked down the side of his face. The lead defense attorney immediately shouted an objection, loudly declaring my statement unresponsive and demanding it be stricken from the record. But the catastrophic damage was already done. The deposition abruptly concluded 15 minutes later. The defense lawyers rapidly packed their briefcases, whispering aggressively to each other, completely blind to the true reality of the situation. As I calmly stood up, smoothed the front of my jacket, and picked up my portfolio. Julian remained entirely paralyzed in his chair. He stared up at me with hollow, terrified eyes, his hands trembling violently against the polished stone table. The arrogant architect of lies finally understood the horrifying truth of his situation. I had not come to this room to defend myself. I had come to roll out a pristine red carpet, leading him directly to his own execution. The federal courthouse was a fortress of heavy mahogany and polished marble. The air conditioning was freezing, but the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The trial had consumed the entire week, dominating national financial news networks. Julian Vance sat on the witness stand, bathed in the severe fluorescent lighting, delivering the performance of a lifetime. He wore a conservative charcoal suit, entirely shedding his usual flashy attire to project an aura of humble, betrayed leadership. For 3 solid hours, he looked directly at the jury box and lied with the terrifying ease of a seasoned sociopath. He painted a masterful, tragic picture of an executive who implicitly trusted his rogue quality assurance director, only to be entirely blindsided by her malicious incompetence. He spoke softly, his voice trembling at exactly the right moments, insisting he had never seen any warning reports regarding the cooling grids. The jury was drinking every single drop of his poison. Then, the bailiff called my name. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored black blazer, and walked up the steps to the witness box. I swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The lead defense attorney approached me, a vicious sneer pulling at his lips, ready to verbally execute me in front of the press. He opened his mouth to launch his first attack, but I cut him off entirely. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a sleek black tablet. I turned my head and addressed the bench directly. "Your Honor," I said, my voice ringing clear and steady across the cavernous room. "Before we proceed with the fabricated narrative presented by the defense, I request permission to connect my device to the central evidentiary monitors of this courtroom. I possess direct, unedited telemetry that will definitively resolve the exact timeline of the hardware failure." The defense attorney immediately screamed a frantic objection, his face turning an angry shade of purple. The judge, an incredibly stern woman with absolutely zero tolerance for corporate theatrics, silenced him with a sharp glare and granted my request. I tapped the screen once. The massive monitors suspended above the jury box instantly flickered to life. I did not show them a static, boring spreadsheet. I displayed a raw, graphical live feed directly from the ghost chips I had buried deep inside the machinery over 3 years ago. The interface was stark black and neon green. "What you are looking at," I explained, projecting my voice to reach the very back rows of the packed gallery, "is the independent diagnostic relay embedded within the main motherboard of every single unit that failed over the Rocky Mountains. This system automatically logged every catastrophic temperature variance exactly 3 weeks before the massive transport contract was signed." I swiped my finger across the tablet. The screen zoomed in heavily on a specific block of code from the critical date in question. The system did not just log the hardware errors, it fired off 13 consecutive to critical warning alarms directly to the executive master terminal. And here, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is the exact response to those alarms. On the massive screens, an administrative access log appeared in bold lettering. Next to a blazing red warning icon was a biometric user identification number, followed by a specific command string. "User ID 001, Julian Vance," I stated, the name dropping like a heavy iron anvil in the quiet room. Command executed override and delete history. Julian bolted upright in the witness chair. "That is an absolute lie," he shrieked, his pristine facade shattering into a million pieces. "She hacked the company servers. She maliciously manipulated that data to frame me. That is completely inadmissible." I turned to look at him, my expression perfectly cold. "You are absolutely correct about one thing, Julian," I said smoothly. "If this data came from the internal corporate servers, it could easily be manipulated, but it did not." I turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, this telemetry was never routed through the company network. It was broadcast directly from the hardware into a decentralized, cryptographic blockchain structure known as an immutable ledger. It is mathematically impossible to alter, erase, or manipulate this data once it is recorded." Julian Vance did not just ignore the safety warnings, he manually deleted them, forced the catastrophic system override, and then sat in this very courtroom today and committed blatant, undeniable federal perjury. The courtroom absolutely erupted. It was a spectacular, deafening explosion of human reaction. The reporters in the gallery began frantically shouting into their phones, scrambling over each other to broadcast the massive twist. The 12 members of the jury sat with their mouths hanging wide open in utter shock, but the most beautiful reaction came from the defense table. The team of expensive, ruthless lawyers practically turned to stone. Then, realizing their client had just dragged them into a massive federal felony, the lead attorney violently pushed his chair back. He stood up, his hands visibly shaking, and desperately shouted for a recess. He rapidly backed away from the table, putting physical distance between himself and Julian, looking at the vice president as if he were radiating a highly contagious, lethal disease. The judge was furious. Her face was flushed with absolute rage as she brought her heavy wooden gavel down repeatedly, the sharp cracks echoing like gunshots over the chaos. "Order in this court!" she roared. She pointed a shaking finger directly at Julian, who was now trembling uncontrollably, his skin a sickly, translucent white. "Bailiff, take the witness into custody immediately. Mr. Vance, you are under arrest for severe perjury and the destruction of evidence." Two heavily armed federal marshals marched up to the stand, grabbed Julian by his expensive jacket, and roughly locked cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. He did not say a single word. His eyes were entirely vacant. 30 minutes later, I walked down the wide marble steps of the federal courthouse. The afternoon sun was blinding. A massive sea of reporters surrounded me, their camera flashes exploding like a violent, silent thunderstorm. I did not stop to give any interviews. I simply kept walking, my head held high, breathing in the crisp air of absolute victory. The fallout was incredibly swift. Following the massive financial settlements and the crushing federal fines, Ethers Biologistics filed for complete bankruptcy liquidation within 45 days. The corporate empire was reduced to dust. As for me, the exact week the trial concluded, I received over 3 dozen lucrative offers from rival technology firms begging me to become their special security consultant. I accepted the best one, named my own astronomical price, and went back to work. Everything unfolded exactly as I had mathematically programmed it. Karma is not a natural, spontaneous phenomenon. It is a highly complex architecture, and it was flawlessly constructed by Alice Kim. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where in the world you are tuning in from. So please let me know down in the comments. If you found today's story compelling and want to support our team, please help us by joining the Patreon channel of Boss Revenge Stories. There, you can listen to the absolute best, highly exclusive true stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by using the Patreon link provided in the description or the pinned comment below. Thank you again for your wonderful support, and have a fantastic day.